To date the girl who gave the opening prayer. She's cute. So we're going to talk about the Hofmann forgeries today. This is the first time I've done this presentation, so I hope I've got the bugs worked out. If you want to learn more, the best book is probably this one. It's by Richard Turley. He was a church historian, Victims. It's the most recent of the four main books that were written about it, I think. And it has the advantage of, the passage of some time, and so a little perspective that the others don't have. It also, because he was working for the church, he has access to things like the journals of the general authorities, which, a lot of the other accounts didn't. So you can kind of get a contemporaneous look at what they were thinking. You all know about the recent Netflix documentary, probably Murder Among the Mormons. So it does what most of the books do, and it tells the story as a mystery. It tells it chronologically, and there's a bit of suspense, or at least attempted suspense. It didn't really shake the global church to its core, as it says there, but maybe shook a few people. So I'm going to do it in a slightly different way. I'm going to tell you what we learned after the fact as I tell you the story as it happened. So a lot of what I'll say was only learned later, but I think it's a little more efficient, and it kind of helps you understand what's going on. Otherwise, you're always kind of jumping back and stuff. So spoiler alert, Mark Hofmann was a forger, a liar, and a triple murderer. Well, double murderer. Tried to kill somebody else. So way back in 1980, Mark Hofmann forged a document that became known as the Anthon transcript. And then he had hid that document in a Bible that he had bought. The Bible had belonged to a granddaughter of Joseph Smith's, and he also forged two of Joseph's other ancestors' signatures in it. And then he put the document in between two of the pages that were quote unquote stuck together. And then he kind of manipulated his wife and, got her to open it with him. The whole point of all this was to create a provenance. Provenance is important for documents because it's always, well, what is this document and where did it come from and where has it been and now that we've got it? So people would be suspicious if you suddenly just started showing up with this stuff. You had to be able to prove where it came from. So that was Hofmann's approach here, is that here he had a Bible that he had associated with the Joseph Smith family by forging signatures. It was also owned by his granddaughter. And so it could make it appear as if this was a family Bible that had been passed down and the document was stuck in, and he wasn't the one who discovered it. It was his. So church history experts ultimately accepted it as true, as a real document, even though they didn't really have the technical skills to evaluate the document scientifically. And they thought it was a copy of what Martin Harris had taken to see Charles Anthon, who was the scholar who Martin went to verify that the plates were real, that the text on it was real. There were some people who were a little concerned that Hofmann wouldn't tell him where he got the Bible, but he used to say that, he wanted to keep his sources confidential. He didn't want other people, getting good stuff from them. And the sources didn't want people to know who they were because they didn't want stuff to get stolen, et cetera, or be taxed. So he told the church historical department that he had somebody who wanted to buy it. That was something he would often do, is he would play one buyer off another. And he offered to trade the document for duplicate materials in the church archives. So ultimately, they traded it to him for a $5 gold coin, some Mormon paper money, and a first edition of the Book of Mormon that was missing a page. So it came into the church's possession. A little while later, Hofmann forges something called the Joseph Smith III blessing. Joseph Smith III was Joseph's son. He had gone on to be head of the RLDS, the Reorganized Church. And the Reorganized Church claimed that Joseph Jr. had ordained his son, Joseph III, to be the prophet. And the LDS Church's point of view, on the other hand, was, well, even if he had a blessing, which we don't have record of, it would depend on him being faithful, and he wasn't. So Hofmann, again, found a document that church history would lead you to expect. People had talked about this blessing. No one had ever seen it, but there was no reason to think it didn't exist. So Hofmann wanted to sell it too. And he went to the church historians and said, I think the Reorganized Church will give me a book of commandments. That's the early book of the Doctrine and Covenants. It's one of the rarest books because you remember the story. They were printing them and then the printing press got burned down. And there are these girls who saved a few pages and they escaped into the cornfields, and then they were bound as books. So this was a really valuable book. So Hofmann figured he could get a lot from it. And the head of the historical department laughs and says, well, if you think you can get a book of commandments out of the Reorganized Church, then you should try. So this is an important point, and I'm going to insist on it over and over again. people still sometimes try to say that the church was trying to hide documents. That's just false, because here you have Hofmann offering this document to the church historical department, and the church historical department going, no, you're asking way too much. We don't want it, right? If you were trying to hide documents, that's when you buy it and you hush it up. It's a strange way to hide documents anyway. Tell them to go sell it to the reorganized church, the ones who are going to make the biggest deal about it. So Hofmann asks the church to check into it. He approaches the reorganized church and offers to sell. They're interested, but they want to verify it. The historians and Hofmann tell President Hinckley, and they say, well, we think it's legitimate. Hofmann goes in to see President Hinckley. He says, oh, I'm a good LDS person. I attend the temple. I'm a returned missionary. He tells the history department, oh, I want the church to have it, not the reorganized church. Meanwhile, the reorganized church historian is still trying to get the letter authenticated so he can buy it. But Hofmann sells it to the church. Which leaves the RLDS church feeling just betrayed, because he understood that they had a deal and Hofmann was competing with someone else. So I think he was worried that Hofmann was using his negotiation to get a higher price from the LDS church. And Hofmann, when they got upset about this, Hofmann acted all very sorry, and he said, "Oh, he says, I'll give back what I got, and we'll get it back to the RLDS church, and I'll get a book of commandments for it, and I'll give it to the church." But the RLDS are fed up with him already. They were wiser than some members of the church. They didn't want to deal with him. The church history office approached and said, "Look, we're sorry. We want to make nice," and so they got it right. President Hinckley talked about it in conference. And so the church seems to have had very little to fear from this document, as long as the historical context was understood. Hofmann gets very angry that the RLDS person is questioning his integrity. He's very, affronted. He said, I could have helped you barricade it, but now I will intend to keep these details for myself. The church historian from the RLDS said, having read your letter of April 6th, I find nothing of either importance or veracity, that's truthfulness, in it, sufficient to warrant sufficient response. Therefore, I simply acknowledge the effort and imagination you expended in creating it. So that's something that could have been said about Hofmann all along. Well, this is classic sociopathic behavior. I've read that some psychologists evaluated Hofmann once he was in jail and said that he wasn't a sociopath. I don't know. I think he shows all the signs of being a sociopath. He's got this rage and anger at his honesty being challenged, when in fact he was a liar. He's trying to manipulate people and get them to back down with his anger. He's using threats and coercion. I think President Wild has experienced this, and it's something you run into in medicine. Okay, part 2. There's 12 parts. Each part gets shorter, so don't panic. So then Hofmann starts a new trick. He starts using one forgery to authenticate another, because the Joseph Smith III blessing was put in the hand of Thomas Bullock, who was a church clerk. And then Hofmann forged another letter to Brigham Young that looked like it was in Thomas Bullock's handwriting. And Bullock says this, he says, I do not believe that it gives you license to destroy every remnant of the blessing which he received from his father. Those promises must be fulfilled. I will not, nay, I cannot surrender that blessing, i.e. the Joseph Smith III blessing, knowing what its certain fate will be if returned, even at the peril of my own livelihood and standing. So Hofmann creates a forgery where it makes it look like Bullock is complaining that the LDS church destroyed all the other evidence of this blessing, but that one has survived at least, and that's the one that Hofmann's produced. So this forgery validates his previous forgery. And Bullock is also portrayed as being at risk of his job or even his life if he leaves the church. And that was part of the narrative that Hofmann wanted to take. The church is going to try to destroy or hide documents that it doesn't like, and it'll threaten your livelihood or your life if you talk. So he takes this document to President Hinckley. He doesn't go to anyone else. And he says, I want you to have this document. And Hinckley said, are you telling me you want to give this document to the church without cost? And Hofmann said, yes. And he told him he didn't keep a copy for himself. And Hinckley said, I thanked him and told him the first presidency would be advised, and he'd tell the managing director of the historical department. We shook hands and he left. And President Hinckley put the document in the first presidency vault. Why did he do that? Why did Hofmann do this? When they interviewed him after he had confessed to all the murders, he said, probably the greatest purpose in my mind was to demonstrate to him my concern for the church, or in other words, possibly a potentially embarrassing document would not fall into hands that might use it against the church, and to prepare him for future dealings as far as if my true interest and intent was the welfare of the church. So again, this is classic sociopathic stuff, right? He's working to establish trust. He's saying, oh, I'll keep secrets and I'll do the right thing. He says, oh, I don't want any money for this. You know, he's also doing what's called splitting. Splitting is where you say different things to different people to alienate them from each other and to make them trust you. So in this case, he was telling President Hinckley that the church historical department had leaked information about it, and that's why he didn't want to deal with them. So I'm just going to deal with you. Okay. Well, 1982, he comes up with the Lucy Smith letter. This is an early letter, supposedly, from Lucy Smith, Joseph's mother. Lucy talks about Book of Mormon contents there and some things that aren't in the present day Book of Mormon. So this got everybody very excited because it looked like this was information from the lost 16 pages. So a collector named Brent Ashworth, brought the document for $30,000 and gave it to the church. Then Hofmann found another letter from David Whitmer, who was one of the three witnesses testifying to the Book of Mormon. He tried to sell it to the church. The First Presidency approved it and actually wanted less than he was initially asking. So again, it's the same stuff, the same sociopathic type behavior. Part 4, do you believe in magic? This is where it starts to get interesting. So he then produces what's called the Stowell letter. This was purportedly a letter from Joseph Smith to the man who hired him to dig for a Spanish silver mine. And those of you who've attended our little discussions about, seer stones and all that, you'll remember that Joseph was involved in that. And so this is from Joseph giving instructions about how to do all this, supposedly. And so the intent in Hofmann's mind was to tie Joseph even closer to this idea of magic and superstition. So it's got Joseph giving all this dowsing advice. It would have been the oldest document in Joseph's handwriting. The church purchased it, but they first got it authenticated. We learned way later that they actually sent it to the FBI and they sent it to a cyclotron out in, or at least some of the documents out to a cyclotron in California. So they really did everything they could to authenticate it, and it passed. So President Hinckley approves the purchase, and the First Presidency Secretary says, okay, we want to buy this. He writes a memo and asks the financial department for a $15,000 check to be made. The check is made the money is given on a church check. They get the document and they put it in the vault. Now, this is not how you go about hiding a document. You don't create a paper trail. You don't tell your secretary, okay, please do a memo and please send it to the people who look after the money. And then please write a check on the church's account, that Hofmann will cash. Okay. So remember all that because it's going to be important. Then there's the Book of Mormon printing contract. So here, this is the contract to print out the Book of Mormon. Hofmann says he bought it for 20, only wants it for 10,000. See, same thing. The Hearst Church History Department says, man, we're going to blow our budget buying that. But the First Presidency said it's okay. And he continues to deal with them. Okay, now the most famous part, the Salamander letter. So to summarize so far, Hofmann has established himself about someone who can find really remarkable and important documents, but he's pretty cagey about where he gets them from. And aside from his slip up with the Joseph Smith III blessing, where he kind of alienated the reorganized church, he's managed to seem not super interested in money and that he's looking out for the church. And he's used one forgery to endorse or to authenticate another forgery. He's also planted the idea that the church would destroy documents to preserve its version of history. And he's gotten at least one person to authenticate a document, to buy it, and to give it to the church. That's the Stowell letter. Pardon me, that's the other one back here. The Lucy Mack Smith letter, sorry. And he's introduced the folk magic idea into the story. So this is interesting. So then a guy named Lynn Jacobs, who actually doesn't come up, I'm told, in the Netflix documentary. So this guy gets kind of written out of the story, but it's an important part of the story, I think, to understand what went on. So Lynn Jacobs is a friend of Hofmann's, and Hofmann gives Lynn Jacobs this document, the Salamander letter. And it's supposedly a letter from Martin Harris, written fairly early in the history of the church, after the church is organized, 30th of October. The church was organized May the 6th, right? And it's a whole bunch about folk magic and superstition and the most famous part is that the angel Moroni turned into a white salamander that struck him 3 times. There's all this kind of treasure digging stuff. So Hofmann forges this and he gives it to Lynn Jacobs. And he says to Jacobs, I don't want people to know I'm involved with this. I don't want the publicity. You sell it and I'll take most of the money and I will give you a cut. So Lynn Jacobs shows up with this to the church. So this is a much more explosive letter, because we kind of, even though in the 1980s, we didn't know a whole lot about kind of the treasure digging aspect of things, but this is much more explosive because it's well after the church is organized, and they're still going on this kick. So, this is the text. We won't bother to read it, but, Harris says Joseph speaks with spirits who guard the money, and then he goes to sleep and wakes up with a dollar coin in his hand, and it's weird stuff. So Lynn Jacobs wants to sell it to the church. He goes into the history department and asks for a $10 Mormon gold coin, which is the rarest and most valuable Mormon money item. At that time, it was $60,000 to $100,000 value. The history department says to President Hinckley, what do you think? And he says, yeah, that's way too high. And Jacob says, okay, I'll sell it for a book of commandments. We're back to that one, $30,000 to $40,000. Hinckley says, this is in a meeting with President Hinckley. President Hinckley says, yeah, I don't know if we really want it. And Jacob says, well, I wonder if Brent Ashworth would buy it. And President Hinckley says, yeah, maybe he would. He's a friend of ours. And that's the end of the meeting. Brent Ashworth later said this about the visit there. He said, Lynn tried to blackmail President Hinckley by saying something to the effect of, it's in the Salamander book. I didn't know anything about this. I had to read the book. But he told his story later and he said, well, if you're not going to buy this, we may have to publicize it or something like that. It was kind of a blackmail move. From what I understand, President Hinckley just kindly showed him the door. So again, this is not how you cover up a damaging document. He's gone to the church history department and said, here, I'll sell it to you. And the church history department's gone, yeah, I don't think so. Presidency would have to approve that. President Hinckley goes, yeah, we don't really want it. The guy says, I'm going to make it public. And President Hinckley says, yeah, whatever, and that's the end of it. So he goes back to the church history department and he's trying to convince, the guy who's the head of the department is trying to convince him that he's asking too much. And he says, you're not going to sell this unless you drop this to a reasonable price. And then he says, what's that? And Schmidt said, well, you get down to a reasonable price and I'll tell you when it's reasonable. And you have to have it, Jacob says to the head of the history department. No, I don't have to have it, said Schmidt. No such thing. So again, he's pushing and pushing to sell it. And Schmidt's like, drop the price or I'm just not interested. If you're trying to suppress this document, which they had read and they saw what was in it, they would have paid him cash under the table and that would have been that. Hofmann also tried to sell it. It was examined by various historical people there. Some of them didn't think that it rang true. So again, if they're trying to keep this out of circulation, why are they dickering with him? Why are they saying, yeah, whatever, doesn't make sense. So the document got purchased. He'd already tried to sell it to Ashworth, but Ashworth said, I think this is a forgery, which really offended Hofmann. Steve Christensen, who is the son of the guy named Mac Christensen, he runs the big suit store or ran the big suit store in Salt Lake called Mr. Mac. Steve Christensen's a businessman. He's doing well. So he buys it for $40,000. Christensen wants to research the document, put it in context before he makes it private. And the church historians are thinking, oh, I don't know how we're going to do that. This is going to require we totally kind of rewrite the early history of the church. So the church panics, right? No, they don't. They already passed up the chance to buy it. President Hinckley gave a report to the Quorum of the 12 and said, yeah, we had the chance to buy this, but it was too high, so we didn't do it. Meanwhile, Time magazine has a religion editor who's an evangelical Christian and who later wrote some rather hostile and biased things about the church in books he published. Sunstone magazine and the founder of Signature Books, who's named George Smith, no relation, thank goodness. They've all heard stuff through the grapevine and they start talking about it. President Hinckley, this is in his journal, so not written for public consumption. He just writes about it. We have nothing to hide. Our enemies will try to make much of this letter, but any fair-minded individual who will read it in terms of the time it was written in the language of the day will not see it as detrimental to the history of those events connected with the restoration of the gospel. So President Hinckley's not worried, even with all the flap. Steve Christensen buys the letter, and he tells the church, look, I'm going to donate it to you eventually after I get it studied. And he calls President Hinckley and said, look, just so you know, I'm going to give it to you, but there's a lot of flap. Should I go public sooner? And President Hinckley says, oh, don't be rushed, just do your work. And so there's no instruction to hide it or to falsify it. He also saw Brent Ashworth, President Hinckley did at this time, and he said, you be sure to tell them, that is people that Ashworth was speaking to, that we're not hiding a thing up here. But if we can get our historians what we get before they go to our enemies, so they can put them in the proper context, then that's what they'd like to do first. That made perfect sense to me, said Ashworth. I could see that any other organization would not be attacked for that, but the church was. President Hinckley, there was so much flap, he made a media statement and said, yeah, it's true, I saw it. I'm not going to comment on it until it's been researched and the owner has, done the thing. It would be improper for me to anyone else to speculate on the contents. I would think no reputable individual or journal would issue a speculative story until such had been done. Well, hope springs eternal, but there were a great many individuals and media groups that were not reputable at all. They were ready to run with it. Also, at this time, Hofmann is starting to manipulate the media. In August 1984, a reporter from Time magazine calls the church and asks about the magic letter, right? The letter from Joseph Smith to Stoll, and says, what do you know about this letter? You remember President Hinckley had bought it and put it in the church vault. And the reporter says, I have a transcript of this letter, so I know it exists. Do you have it? So the history department hasn't heard about it because President Hinckley has it in the vault. And so the history department gets this request and they say, we don't know anything about this. We don't have it. And President Hinckley hears the story and says, oh yeah, that's right. They don't have it. I've got it. Well, that doesn't look good, right? So in retrospect, it was clear that Hofmann was feeding this to the media. He knows that the church has the document and he can give the transcript, even though you remember he told President Hinckley he wasn't keeping copies. And again, this is not how you suppress a document. You don't pay for it with a church check. So President Hinckley writes another press release and says, I understand you guys are asking about this. The history department doesn't have it. I have it. I handled the purchase. It's in my office. We're going to get it analyzed and, studied. And meanwhile, I would assume no journalist of integrity would wish to publish it. Yeah, well, again, hope springs eternal. But before President Hinckley can even release that statement, the letter goes public. Everyone at the time was not necessarily buying into all this. Elder Maxwell said, we don't know if this is authentic yet. That was in September. Bruce R. McConkie was skeptical about a variety of the forgeries, especially the Joseph Smith III letter. Anyway, but people are pretty much running with it and assuming that they're authentic. So Steve Christensen tells President Hinckley, well, we've authenticated it. The experts have said it's real. And he says, I've got a problem. Hofmann has offered to buy the letter back for $50,000 and then sell it to somebody else. Does the church still want it? And Hinckley says, well, yeah, we'd like the church to have it because, we would rather study it and explain it rather than have our enemies do it. And Christensen says, well, I'd like to do that, but I'm having trouble with my business. And so I'm in financial trouble. It's really hard for me to be able to afford to do this. Hinckley says, okay, well, let's see if we can work something out. But before any of that can happen, he writes him back and says, never mind, my business turned around. Everything's okay. I'm good. I'm gonna give you the letter. Don't worry about it. I can afford it. So on 12th of April, Christensen donates the letter. That's him donating it to President Hinckley right there. The First Presidency released a statement about it when the church published the full text later that month. So again, this is not how you hide a document. You don't publish it in the Deseret News. And he said it was purportedly written by Martin Harris and has said that there is no indication that it is a forgery. So they didn't endorse it. They just said, this is what people are saying, and said that the researchers will be discussing it. President Hinckley later talked about no one can be certain that he wrote the document. At the moment, we accept the judgment of the examiner that it's not a forgery. And that doesn't mean that it wasn't forged at a time when the church had many enemies. The Salt Lake chief of police later said, the LDS church has been into a pernicious position on the question of that document, the Salamander letter. Very frankly, people are beating up on them. It's not fair. It was a donated document. So Hofmann continues to do what he's doing. He continues to be an anonymous story about the Stoll letter. You remember he said they don't have it. The church history department sends a letter saying, okay, sorry, our bad. We didn't know President Hinckley had it. We weren't trying to mislead you. George Smith, who's this atheist guy who publishes a lot of stuff undermining the church or trying to, he says, yeah, that's right. The church doesn't own it. President Hinckley owns it personally. That's so the church has plausible deniability. They can say the church doesn't own it and they're telling the truth technically, but it's really President Hinckley that owns it. But as we've seen, that's false. It was paid for with church money. There was a church memo requesting the money and it was written on a church check. But that doesn't matter. The media run with that story and claim that President Hinckley is really the one that owns it and the church is stonewalling about it. There's still other people there who doubt the authenticity of it. So it goes back and forth. Hofmann presents Steve Christensen with a transcript of the contract between Joseph Smith and Stoll to dig for treasure. And Hinckley says, well, that's interesting. I don't think I've seen that before. The enemies of the church will be having a great time. Their efforts will fade while the murk forwards. So Hoffman's really getting clever now, right? Now he doesn't even have to produce the documents. He's just providing a transcript and telling people that that's what it says. And people are trusting him because he seems to be this guy who's good at finding documents. So he doesn't even have to forge it. He can just say, this is what it says. And the other thing that does, of course, is it establishes him as a reliable source or a source that can give you good information. So they'll believe him about the other more damaging things. So just to get you a sneak peek into how this all plays out, later in the story, Hofmann buys a book from a rare book dealer. He takes the book home and then he brings it back a few days later and he said, you know what, I found a Martin Harris signature in this. And so because it's got Martin Harris's signature in it, it suddenly becomes way more valuable. And so Hofmann, ever playing the good guy, comes back and says, you know, I feel bad. You sold this to me without knowing it's there. I really should have paid more. So I've sold it to the church. I want to give you guys half. And so, oh, that's very nice. Well, very nice, but the problem is that there were very few samples of Martin Harris's handwriting, especially from early on in church history. And it just so happened that this signature precisely matches the signature on Hofmann's forged salamander letter. So once again, Hofmann has created his own authentication. He's provided one signature that makes people go, see, look, this is real. Here's where the imaginary stuff really gets going. So there are rumors about an Oliver Cowdery history, an early history by Oliver Cowdery written. And the First Presidency's checks, and they don't have it. The Church Historical Department, no one's ever seen it there. But the archives at that point aren't completely indexed and cataloged. And so it could be somewhere that nobody's thought to look. That's one thing that changed after all this, is they became much better at managing the archive. So they find a journal by Oliver, but it's from later. It's not the history. They'd forgotten they had it, but it had actually been published a few years earlier. So others began asking questions about it, saying there's this anonymous source talking about it. One source gives them a very detailed description of the history. He says, you know, it's 10 inches by so many inches. It's in this kind of book. It's about a quarter way through, and President Hinckley knows where it is, or he would have as of January. Well, guess who the anonymous source was? Yeah, your friend and mine, Hofmann. And so because Hofmann had purchased the Stoll letter and, according to the media, suppressed it, Hofmann's now making it look like he knows that the history does exist and President Hinckley is hiding that too. So it's all part of the conspiracy, supposedly. An anti-Mormon newsletter passes on rumor that Hofmann has found the second facsimile of the Book of Abraham, you know, and he's going to sell or give it to the church. And that looks like confirmation of these shady dealings. But this doesn't exist. None of this stuff exists. It's only in Hofmann's imagination or his story. How do you prove that you don't have a document and that you've never had the document? People can just claim you're stonewalling and you're lying. And again, doesn't have to produce the documents. And nobody can check on Hofmann or anything. They just call him an anonymous source. The newspapers never ask for any documents to prove it. They never verify him. They just trust this single anonymous source and run with it. And it also helps him because the more buzz Hofmann creates around documents, the more he can charge. President Hinckley in his journal by this point says the media, feasting on anything they can dig up that might prove embarrassing to the church, are having a field day. It will not adversely hurt the work in the long term, but it does produce some wounds among the weak and those of little faith. More anonymous tips come in. So the church is getting pretty frustrated at this point because people keep talking about this Cowdery history and they've looked everywhere and they can't find it. And the anonymous source claims that he has seen it in the First Presidency vault. But the vault isn't that big. They know it's not there. And the secretary to the first presidency knows no one can get into that vault without him and the combination. Even the first presidency can't get in. So they don't know who this guy is who claims to have seen it. And, the secretary to the president would have had to show them the document, and he can't find it and has no memory of doing that. Another anonymous source tells people that the church has been given documents with the facsimile and said that the first presidency has this. So Hofmann has this looking like a real conspiracy. The Stoll letter, which President Hinckley supposedly bought himself. He didn't, but supposedly. The Oliver Cowdery history, the facsimile number 2. It's just snowballing. What else is the church hiding? Well, then the McClellan connection. So people then begin to ask about this collection. McClellan was an early member of the Quorum of the 12, and he was later excommunicated for chastity issues. I think it's even mentioned that he needs to be careful about adultery in the Doctrine and Covenants. So if you think your life's bad, at least you're not in Scripture being warned not to fornicate, I suppose. So the church gets asked about this McClellan collection that supposedly contains diaries and early church stuff. And again, he based it on stuff that was known from church history. Joseph Smith talked about how McClellan, after he apostatized, had stolen a bunch of stuff from Joseph's office. So there was a kind of plausibility to this, that, this early stuff, McClellan had it, and it was going to undermine the church. And the rumor was that the church had bought it for $100,000 and then buried it. So there's a guy named Alvin Rust. He's a rare document and coin dealer in Salt Lake. Out of the blue, he calls up quite excited and wants to talk about documents that Hofmann has given to President Hinckley. And Rust says, Hofmann promised me those documents, and I paid Hofmann $175,000 to get them, and I haven't seen them, and my business is going to go bust if I don't get those things back. So he's pretty upset. And Rust sends a letter in to President Hinckley where he kind of explains in a bit more detail. And he says, look, my son went with Hofmann to collect this McClellan collection. Hofmann kind of ditched him, made the purchase by himself with Rust's money, and he won't talk to me. I don't know where he is. Hofmann did tell me that you guys maybe wanted to buy it. So I've been waiting, hoping to get my money back when you guys buy it, but I haven't heard anything, and I'm kind of getting nervous. Can you please at least just kind of call me and tell me that everything's on the up and up? So President Hinckley gets this letter, and he doesn't know anything about it. He's like, nobody's talked to him about this. Well, the next day, who shows up at President Hinckley's office but Mark Hofmann? And he says, oh, by the way, President Hinckley, have you gotten a letter from Rust? And Rust would later tell people that he had actually told Hofmann about the letter when he was talking to him on the phone to try to threaten him and say, I'm writing President Hinckley and we're going to work this up. And Hofmann gets all upset, because the tale's going to implode if his victims ever start talking to each other. So when President Hinckley says, well, yes, actually, I did get a letter from Brother Rust. What's going on? Hofmann says, oh, I can explain it all. So I heard about this from the church history department, this collection, but they wouldn't sell it to the church, and the papers were mortgaged as collateral for a bank loan. So Rust gave me $175,000 to pay what they asked. I have the papers, but Rust has broken our deal to keep it quiet for the church's sake. And Rust is trying to make the church look bad. So my plan is I'm going to get a bank loan. I'll pay Rust his money back. And then I'm going to give the collection to the church. And this is probably what it makes it seem what Rust is talking about. This is the confusion. I think President Hinckley concludes, oh, okay, Hofmann wants to get us this and Rust is misunderstood. And then after Hofmann gives it to the church, he's going to pay off the bank loan because he has another deal coming through that's going to make him a lot of money, and everything will be good. Rust will have his money back with interest. Hofmann will have done the right thing and contributed it to the church. The church will have this supposedly damaging set of documents, and Hofmann will be in the clear because he's got money from this sale. What is this sale? Well, Hofmann claims he's found a copy of the Oath of a Freeman. It's supposedly the first document ever printed in North or South America. No one's ever found a copy of it, but he's got one, and he's going to sell it for $1.5 million to the Library of Congress. He did have it, and they were going to buy it, but it was forged, as they learned later. He tells him that there's diaries, affidavits, everything in this McClellan collection. President Hinckley says, well, great, you go settle up with Brother Rust, and then I'm happy to talk about, we'd be happy to have the gift of the papers from you. And since he thinks that Hofmann has explained that Rust is going to get his money, President Hinckley doesn't reply back to Brother Rust. If there's one mistake, you might say, in this whole story, that's probably it. But you got to understand, Rust said this much later. I mean, it wiped him out financially, Hofmann's stuff. Rust he lost virtually everything. And he struggled with his emotions and wondered why Gordon Hinckley had not responded to his letter about the McClellan collection. It wasn't until I heard the facts that I was able to adjust my feelings, he later said, because I was basing a lot of what was unknown. When he learned how Hofmann had assured Hinckley that his debt to Rust would be quickly repaid, Rust asked himself how he would have reacted had Hinckley written him questioning Hofmann. He decided he would have asked Hofmann about the matter and would have dropped it had Hofmann assured him the matter would be quickly resolved. I would have done the same thing that President Hinckley did, Rust concluded, adding, and I'm not near as busy as he is. You got to remember, at this stage, President Hinckley was the only member of the first presidency that was functioning. President Kimball was very ill and not doing much, and his two counselors, President Romney and President Tanner, were worse than him. So they actually called President Hinckley as the third counselor in the first presidency. So President Hinckley was running the entire first presidency on his own, without really, he would say, I'm not the president of the church, but he had to make all these decisions. Hinckley's son later said that it was the most stressful time of his father's life because he had all this responsibility and didn't really have the authority to go with it because he wasn't the church president. So this is what Hofmann would say later about President Hinckley. And he said his interest wasn't so much in having the church obtain it as having it go someplace where he didn't want the church to obtain it. He just wanted to make sure it didn't fall into the enemy's hands, which was good since I knew I didn't have it and I knew the church couldn't obtain it. So even Hofmann later admitted President Hinckley didn't really want it, because if you think about, with all this going on, if the church had bought it, then everybody would have just said, oh yeah, they bought it, and they're suppressing some of what's in it. They're not going to announce what's in it. They're going to bury the stuff that's embarrassing. It was far better from the church's point of view that somebody else buy it, prove what was in it, and then said, okay, I'm giving all this to the church. And then everything's above board. Everybody knows the score. So this is where the banks get involved. So Hofmann tells Steve Christensen, this guy who got the letter that he donated to the church, the Salamander letter. He says, I'll donate this McClellan to the church, this thing to the church. They've tried to buy it, but the owner wouldn't sell. I've got a short window to do this. The deal is closed in 2 days. Always be skeptical when someone says you must ask now or the deal's going away. That's always a bad sign. He says, I need $195,000 to close the deal. So he's going up even from what he's told Rust and President Hinckley. And he says, can you fund me? And then I'll pay you back. And Christensen says, well, I'd love to, but my business is struggling. I don't got money to throw around on documents. And he says, but I do know Hugh Pinnock. He's one of the 70. He had a long career in banking and business and stuff. He knows people. Let's go talk to him and see if he can help us do something here. So Hofmann tells Elder Pinnock that George Smith, this is the anti-Mormon guy, and another anti-Mormon named Wesley Walters are trying to purchase the collection. So again, the church is worried, Elder Pinnock is worried about this. They don't want these guys to get it and either suppress stuff or, what are they going to do with it? They're going to make the church look bad. So Pinnock says to Elder Oaks, Dallin H. Oaks, who's one of the apostles, he says, well, will the church help do this? And Elder Oaks says, emphatically not. We are not getting involved with this. A, it's way too much money. And B, only President Hinckley could authorize that. And he's not even here. He's in Europe. So he says, us getting it would just make more speculation we're hiding it. So we don't want anything to do with this deal. He says, if someone gave us a gift, gifted it to us, we'd accept it, and look after it. And so he says, so what I don't understand is why, if this Hofmann guy says he has this sale going down for 1.5 million, why is he hitting us up for money? He could get a bank loan. A bank would loan him the money if they know he's got this deal going down. He can buy it and then he can pay the bank back with interest. And Elder Pinnock says, well, should I introduce Hofmann to somebody at the bank? And Elder Oaks says, I don't see any harm in that, provided it was clearly understood that all parties, the church was not a party or a guarantor. Hugh Pinnock was not a party or a guarantor to such a loan. So he's basically saying, yeah, introduce him. But this isn't the church. We don't want anything to do with this. So the bank, he introduces him to the bank. The bank checks out the sale and it's legit. The Library of Congress is going to pay Hofmann 1.5 million. And they were. And so the bank says, great, here's your $185,000. And when the deal goes down in a few months, you'll pay us back. And so Hofmann says to everybody, good news, I've got the collection. It's in a safe deposit box. And once the deal is all done, then I'll be able to give it to the church. Well, this collection is completely fictitious. It doesn't exist. But Hofmann has told these stories to all these people. Hoffman does make one document from it and brings it to Elder Pinnock to show him. So, oh, see, we've got it. I've got it. Here it is. It's coming. The anti-Mormon Sandra and Gerald Tanner, they get rumors from an anonymous source, again, that McClellan collection is being purchased by a private individual. So again, they're saying, oh, see, President Hinckley's up to his old tricks. He's going to buy it so the church can say they don't have it, and he's going to bury it. Later on, it's learned that Hofmann spent the money the day he got it, paying off another debt to somebody else. Part 9, we're almost done. We're getting there. This is where the wheels come off. Well, Hofmann doesn't pay the bank loan back because there's a delay in the oath of the freeman being approved. They're waffling on it. They don't want to pay that much. There's concerns about it. So he needs this money, but he can't pay. So Christensen and Pinnock are repeatedly on his case. You've got to pay that back. At one point, Elder Pinnock says, Mark Hofmann came in and made several semi-wild promises about the money he owes the bank, but he did not deliver anything he said. The whole situation has left me concerned and discouraged with him. Man, he's really nicer than I would have been at that point. So after meeting with Elder Pinnock, Hofmann shows up at the rare book department of Deseret Book, and he looks very distraught. Hofmann was usually a fairly calm together guy, but he was very upstraught. He needed to make money desperately, and so he tried to sell his own book collection, which was worth a lot of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars. He wanted to sell it to Deseret Book for some cash, and then says, and I'll buy it back once my deal goes through. The dealer notices that Hofmann's being followed by a guy or some guys. Seems like one is what he remembers. But the dealer says, no, we're not going to make this deal real fast. I got to talk to my bosses, come on back. So he comes back again and says, well, I got this piece of papyrus I'll sell it to you for $40,000 from the McClellan collection. The dealer says, no, I'm not going to do that. And Hofmann says, well, keep it quiet. And the dealer says, well, I know Steve Christensen is involved with buying this McClellan thing. If Hofmann is trying to sell pieces of it, that's not fair. Whoever bought it should get all of it. So he calls Christensen up and says, Hofmann was just in here looking for money. And Christensen is, of course, furious at this because Hofmann still owes the bank the money and he's not paying it back. The rest of the story, this is the jump. There's this guy from Idaho. He's an Idaho farmer named Thomas Wilding, and he and a bunch of investors lend Hofmann, this is a completely different deal, $300,000 so they can go buy this manuscript that Hofmann tells them about. Well, that loan is due on the 14th, one day before the bombings that we'll see happened. So Wilding and his brother-in-law went to the bank at one point with Hofmann and were seen following him. And some people at that time believed that they were church security officers. And so this story went around that church security was tailing Hofmann or keeping him under surveillance. It's complete baloney. It was these guys, but that didn't come out till later. So they had taken him to the bank because they wanted some of their money back and Hofmann wasn't producing. And there was only $18,000 in the bank account and they had given him $300,000. So they were not happy campers. At that point, that's when Hofmann goes to Deseret Book to try to sell his library. And that's why there was somebody following him, is because these guys were hanging around saying, you better get our money. Well, if you aren't dealing with the nice Mormon, this situation plays out about how you would expect. This is from this is later from the trial, comes out at trial, or the preliminary hearing. There was never a trial. For the next 2 hours after Hofmann doesn't get the money, the men interrogated Hofmann, who explained he'd already sent the rest of the money east. Hofmann claimed their money had already been spent to purchase the oath of a freeman, but he said he would find other investors to replace them and he would have their money back to them. So this is what the prosecuting attorney asked the person testifying. Was there any frustration on your part or Mr. Jensen's part concerning the inability of Mr. Hofmann to return your money during that day? Certainly, as the guy says. This is on the stand. So you imagine he's downplaying a little bit. There was a large amount of money at risk there, a lot of people involved. So there was a great deal of frustration. I mean, I'm sure they're furious at this point. They say, describe him. They say, well, for the first hour, he had a detached arrogance, which is typical psychopath stuff or sociopath. Well, this plays out in a kind of a Quentin Tarantino movie scene. A lawyer says, so what did that concern cause you to do, Mr. Jensen? It caused great concern, he acknowledged. It caused me more emotional and it caused me great concern and it caused Mr. Jensen anger. Did Mr. Jensen do anything at that meeting because of the anger? Yes, he did. What did he do? He punched Mr. Hofmann. So Hofmann gets beat up. He gets roughed up. And a lot of people have said they think this was the first time Hofmann had ever been in a physical fight or anything. And so this terrifies him because he realizes that he's in deep now. He's not dealing with nice church history guys and Deseret Book people and general authorities. He's dealing with these guys from Utah who are hounding him and are putting him in a little room and beating him up, if he doesn't get their money. So it really makes you wonder what else went down in that meeting that they didn't really want to tell the cops, but anyway. So the church is fed up, but they're not punching Mark Hofmann in a little room. So Steve Christensen tells the guy at Deseret Book, he says, Elder Pinnock and he doesn't say Elder Pinnock and Elder Oaks, but he says there's a 70 and a member of the 12 who's really frustrated with Hofmann. We can't find him. If he doesn't settle his debts, he's going to be washed out as a document dealer. Nobody's going to trust him. They're going to think he's a crook. The bank is ready to sue him and, start criminal proceedings. I can't find him. Remember, this is way before the internet, way before cell phones. Hofmann was notoriously difficult to track down. He would never answer the phone when you called him. You had to kind of drive by his house and find him. And he says, so if you talk to him, tell him that he has got to repay that loan, Christensen says. So Hofmann shows up at President Hinckley's office, tells him about some leaks. Christensen, so again, he's still trying to ingratiate himself. Christensen tracks Hofmann down and brings him to see Elder Pinnock. Hofmann has this convoluted story. Pinnock says, well, if you can't afford it, if you can't pay the debt back, the only thing you can do is sell the McClellan connection. Rather than you try to buy it and donate to us, you've just got to sell it. You've got to settle your financial problems, and then we'll sort out the donation. So this isn't this is an attempt to suppress anything. Again, if Elder Pinnock or President Hinckley or Elder Oaks, if they're worried about what's in this is where you slip Hofmann some money and you get the thing. You don't say, well, you better sell it to somebody else then. So Elder Pinnock goes up, talks to Elder Oaks, who tells President Hinckley, and Hinckley says, we are not going to help with this. We are not buying the collection. Oaks says, yeah, if we buy it and donates, it's fine, but we're not getting involved. So Elder Pinnock calls David Sorensen, who's a wealthy guy, and says, look, we're having a thing here. If you bought this and donated to the church, it would be a tax write-off for you. And Sorensen, when interviewed, said that Elder Pinnock was very clear that the church wasn't involved, that it was, that this was a completely, separate deal. And Soren says, well, my natural skeptical tendency makes me think this doesn't exist at all. I think you're being sold a line of goods. If I'm going to buy this, I don't want to buy an empty box. So I want it authenticated before I buy it. So they choose Steve Christensen, this guy who's been working with him, to authenticate it because he knows all about this, supposedly. So Elder Oaks talks to Sorensen by phone and says, it's up to you to decide it, to investigate it and satisfy you if it's worth what it's being paid. It's an arm's length thing. We're not part of this. And Sorensen says, yep, I get it. That's Sorensen, not Elder Sorensen, sorry, but it's Sorensen who says that. So that's Sorensen's testimony. So Hofmann, but things are getting worse because Hofmann knows that an autograph expert, one of the leading document experts in the United States, is coming to Salt Lake City in October. And he knows that Rendell, this guy, knows Christensen, the guy who's supposed to authenticate the McClellan papers. And Christensen's thinking of buying that little bit of papyrus that Hofmann was trying to sell for $40,000 to Deseret Book. There's one problem. Hofmann had bought that papyrus from Rendell a few months earlier. So this guy is coming to Salt Lake, and Hofmann knows that if Christensen and Rendell meet, the gig is up. And so people describe this as a Ponzi scheme. Essentially what Hofmann did over a long period of time is he would borrow money, he would buy documents, and then or claim to buy documents, and then he would use that money to pay off previous deals and get money from that. And so it was this cycle or this series. But at a certain point, that sort of thing collapses. And that's what's happening here is Hofmann can't get the next big score to pay off the last big score. And his checks are bouncing all over town. He eventually owes $1.1 million around, and that's in 1985 dollars, right? That's a ton of money. Things get worse for Hofmann. Sorensen's lawyer is being very careful. He's like, nobody else is going to touch this. I'm going to be in charge of this thing. We're going to keep the money. We're going to treat it like a real estate transaction, right? We're going to make sure the money's in escrow. We're going to verify that what we're buying is there. Then and only then will I release the money. Hofmann goes up to President Hinckley, tries to sell him some more stuff. Hinckley says, yeah, we're not interested. So the deal is set to go down on the 15th of October. Hofmann claims he's got the McClellan collection in the bank, in the safe deposit box. So they're going to go to the bank. Christensen is going to take the McClellan papers, He will verify them, then Hofmann will get his money. That's the deal. Well, that leads to the murders. We'll go quickly now. This is the end of the story. So Hofmann ultimately set a bomb that killed Steve Christensen. And then Gary Sheets is another guy who was Christensen's business partner. You remember their business was trouble. And Sheets worried that the bomb was because of their business. Nobody was thinking about documents at this time. Later that day, another bomb exploded, killing Kathy Sheets, who was Sheets' wife. So Christensen and looks like Sheets, his partner, seem to have been the targets of these bombings. Funny enough, Elder Hofmann runs into Elder Oaks in a parking garage and says, "What should I do if I'm questioned about those bombs?" And Elder Oaks says, "Well, tell the truth." And he says, "But why would you be involved? It's got nothing to do with you. Like, do you think there's a reason it can be with you?" Hofmann says, "No." And Elder Oaks says, "Well, just tell the police the truth and be done with it." The next day, a third bomb explodes. Accidentally, we learn later, injuring Hofmann himself. So this is the point where suddenly everybody starts to go, "Oh my gosh, this isn't about the failing business. This is about the documents. Oh my gosh, Hofmann's the guy who found these. Christensen's one of the guys. Kathy Sheets, that's a decoy. Maybe the church is behind these. All sorts of theories start floating around. Some people thought that this was a suicide attempt, but the bomb squad was very clear that the explosion was not consistent with what Hofmann said. He probably jiggled the bomb when he got into the car, dinged it on the gear shift, and they were made with mercury switches. So if you tipped the mercury would connect the circuit and the bomb would go off. So that's probably what happened, is he tried to put the package down and it went off on him. Blew him out of the car. The door was open. That's the only thing that saved his life. Blew some fingers off his hand, wrecked his knee, etc. So that all goes down, but because what Hofmann has told them about the bomb doesn't match what they know happened from the crime scene, they're immediately suspicious, but they can't figure out what the motive is, right? They figure out that Hofmann could have done it. They track down materials he used. They even track a check that he didn't have any cash on him. So when he was buying one of the mercury switches to make the bomb, it was $2. He didn't have $2. So he wrote a check under a false name for $2 to a Radio Shack somewhere out of state. As it turns out, they got the check and they found his fingerprint on the check, if you want to talk lucky. Okay. So they know that the story isn't adding up, but for a murder, you need means, you need motive, and you need opportunity. Well, he's got opportunity and he's got means, but why is he doing this? Christensen's the guy who's going to solidify this deal. Okay. Well, ultimately, there's a guy named Throckmorton who's a document examiner, and he gets shown one of the documents by one of the church historians, and he starts to say, "Well, how do you know this isn't a forgery?" And the church historian guy says, "Well, who would ever think to forge? Why would anybody want to forge a historical document?" And so this guy, the penny drops, and he goes, "You know what? All these guys, they have never done a scientific analysis of these documents. They've just been looking at them as historical documents and saying, yeah, it makes sense. But nobody has examined the paper or the ink or, done everything they need to do." So he goes to the police. The police kind of take him on in transfer from the Attorney General's office, and they're trying to get the documents. They need the originals from the church so they can study this and build a case against Hofmann. Well, the attorney for the church is doing what attorneys are supposed to do, and that's he's trying to make sure nothing bad happens to the church. And he's sitting there pounding the desk saying, "It's my job to protect the president of the church, and you are not getting those documents." And so they don't get anywhere. Then they meet with Elder Oaks, and this is what Throckmorton said about Elder Oaks. He said, "He knows the law, so I thought maybe we can talk to him. Plus, he's an apostle. That helps." We walked in and sat down with him and explained what had happened, and he was not pleased with what had previously happened. He was not pleased with the lawyer. He actually stood up and he looked at me and he said, "You will have the total and complete cooperation of the church." And he turned to me and he says, "If there's anybody that is not cooperating with you, you let me know personally." And from that time on, the doors were open. We got anything we wanted. So then to trial. So ultimately, Hofmann was charged with murder. The case didn't go to trial because there was a lot of evidence that came out at preliminary hearing. It included him being in the proper spot to set the bombs, buying the materials, discovery of forgery and equipment. The forensic document examiners, Throckmorton and his partner, Bill Flynn, they're the big heroes because they figured out stuff that nobody had ever figured out before. Part of the problem was the FBI and everybody was using modern techniques, for use on modern inks. Hofmann had made ink that was a lot like what, well, it was essentially was what they used back in the day. And nobody at that point had really worked on that because nobody was worried about forgeries of, 200 years ago. They were worried about check fraud and, contract fraud. So a lot of the stuff that they needed to know, they just didn't because nobody did that kind of work. So Throckmorton kind of invented a lot of it as he worked on these documents for over a year. I think it was a year and a half. That's too long a story to talk about, but there's a fair talk where by Throckmorton himself, where he kind of talks about this. So I'll leave that on the screen for just 10 seconds or so if you want to screenshot that if you're interested in it. Or if you Google Throckmorton fair talk, you'll probably find it. So anyway, it's a fascinating story, but we could talk the whole time on that. So for a while, the police were suspicious of President Hinckley because Hofmann would tell people that, his phone would ring at his house and people would say, who is that? And he'd just say, oh, it's President Hinckley just calling to talk to me. It was complete baloney. But, President Hinckley wasn't even in the air, or it was clear that he wasn't in retrospect. But the police were like, well, geez, is this Hinckley guy in on it? Because the church had also forgotten about the Bullock Young letter. You remember, which Hofmann gave the church. It's the one where the guy complained about Brigham destroying the Joseph Smith III blessing. So while the church is going through all their files, they suddenly realize that they have this. Now, this could look embarrassing because this could look like yet another document they've suppressed. Nobody's mentioned it. Nobody's talked about it. But when the church finds it, they turn it over to the police. They also charged Hofmann with defrauding Hinckley because they were still going with the Hinckley bought the Stowell letter privately, not on the church stationery. Again, eventually that got straightened out, but it went in the media and, people were again, oh, President Hinckley's behind all this. Ultimately, Hofmann pled guilty after they saw all the forgery evidence. I think they decided that it was time to cut bait. So he confessed, he explained how he did the forgeries. The forgeries are now worth considerable money. It's funny, I just heard last week through the grapevine that his Oath of the Freeman, one of his forgeries, is actually going up for auction. And everybody's watching it close because hasn't really happened. Nobody knows what it's worth. Nobody knows what the market's going to do for it. So collectors of this stuff are really interested because, in some ways, Hofmann's stuff has become valuable because of what he was involved in. He admitted that he had lost his faith at age 14 and become an atheist. And so he wanted to kind of remake the church in his image, the history. Someone asked President Wild where the forgeries all now. The church has all the ones that were given or bought by it or contributed. Hofmann was sentenced to the rest of his life in the Utah State Prison. You really get a hint of his sociopathic attitude when he talks about the bomb that killed Kathy Sheets, which he admitted he had done in an effort to try to distract attention, to make it look like the bombings were about the failed business, not about the documents. This is what he said. He just left it and the guy's wife picked it up. The time I made that bomb, my thoughts were that it didn't matter if it was Mr. Sheets, a child, or a dog. And he says he was asked about the imaginary Oliver Cowdery history, and they said, this was causing trouble for the church. What were you thinking? And he says, as far as my feelings, there was actually a mixture of emotions. One of them was amusement for the whole idea. This typical sociopath stuff, right? Manipulating people, controlling them, having the power. As far as embarrassment to the church, it was true it was embarrassing, but I was interested to see how the church would react to the situation, right? So it's this amused, that's the kind of guy you're dealing with. He attempted to rationalize. Anyway, conclusion, we're almost there. There's a few lessons to take from this. One is a lesson of integrity, Hugh Pinnock. So once the bank had done its due diligence. Remember, he's the one who introduced Hofmann to the bank. But afterwards, the bank said, well, we never would have given that loan if Elder Pinnock hadn't introduced him. And even though they'd made it clear it wasn't. And the bank had an internal evaluation, and their own documents say they discussed it in detail and found no violation of policy or law. Despite that, they blamed Pinnock and they said, you're on the hook for this. And Pinnock said, my honor means more than anything, I'll pay it. It was an enormous financial hardship. It took most of his liquid retirement assets. He was victimized by Hofmann, but he kept his integrity. And given that it was the bank's own decision and they later decided that it was proper, I think somebody there kind of exploited his honesty and his desire to keep the church above reproach. The other lesson, beware media accounts. That's true today as it was then. The Salt Lake Tribune, the newspaper, was founded as an anti-Mormon newspaper, and it is a half-serious joke in LDS circles that very little has changed ever since. The Tribune and others began to claim that Elder Pinnock had gotten the loan for Hofmann inappropriately. President Hinckley talks about how he was disgusted. They're not interested in finding a solution. They're only trying to make the church look bad. It's amazing how much was written based on one anonymous source with nothing else, no confirmation, no corroborating evidence. This is an example of all the bad reporting that went down. The second bombing victim, Kathy Sheets, was erroneously described as a man. She was also described as Steve Christensen's wife, the wife of a church historian, a co-purchaser of the Salamander letter, a person involved in the public debate over the letter, someone who had dealings with Hofmann, or a person who was linked to controversial research on the origin of the Mormon church. None of that was true. She was the wife of Christensen's business partner, and that was all. And as Hofmann said, he didn't really care who got the second bomb. That's all stuff that the media reported. One report said she died 3 hours before Christensen did. Another, they both died in the same explosion. Church officials' roles were misconstrued. Many news reports were couched in ambiguous terms that stopped short of accusing them of ordering the bombings, yet allowed for the possibility. One story said, bombings, killings connected to the Mormon church? What in the world is going on in Utah? It said Steve Christensen had produced the letter. The church leaders were enraged and labeled it blasphemous. None of that happened. One station says one of the church's biggest critics says the letter was embarrassed to the church and that's why the bombings happened, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is one of my favorite parts of the story. Elder Oaks had just been made apostle when this all went down, and a reporter from BYU asked a question of him at the press conference, and well, I'll read it to you. Why is the church so intent on getting the papers? Is it to secure them in the right hands so they're not taken advantage of and make the church look bad? And where does the money come to purchase these letters? This is a BYU. And Oaks recognized part of the question as something he'd already answered. May I take the first part of that? He said to President Hinckley. Yes, Hinckley replied, go ahead. Oaks then repeated the answer he gave from the question when it was asked earlier at the conference. I thought it was clear from my statement that the church was very intent on not getting the papers so that there would be no misunderstanding about this. Could you rephrase that question? Probably was not a comfortable thing. Later on, the church remained quiet during a lot of this because they were very afraid of looking like they were trying to influence the investigation or prejudice it. So they kept quiet when a lot of false claims were made, though they eventually tried to make their point after the confession. President Oaks said this, I was saddened but not surprised that the news coverage of the truth about the forgeries and lies of Mark Hofmann was small by comparison with the early trumpeting of the claims that his newly discovered documents destroyed faith, compromised church leaders, and rocked the foundation of the church. In the course of this episode, we have seen some of the most sustained and intense LDS church bashing since the turn of the century. Unfortunately, I think we've outdone that period. Third lesson. So the media, be very careful. And if that's true, these were print media. These were supposedly respectable journalists who are using, if they're going to get it wrong, what do you think your buddy on Reddit or some blog is going to do? Third thing, critics then and now exploit human nature. Hofmann was the source of all the stuff about the First Presidency Vault. And they said, what was the deal with that? He said, if there's a characteristic, this shows how kind of sociopathic Hofmann is. He says, I'm getting philosophical now. There's a characteristic of human nature that if something is unknown, people imagine the worst. That's basically how it is with the First Presidency's Vault. People imagine that everything is in there and that it's being kept in there to cover it up by the church or whatever, which I don't believe is true. But people like to imagine all kinds of interesting skeletons in the closet. And so it's this very manipulative, and so he took advantage of that, unfortunate human tendency. Here's another one. This is a modern day one, but it involves Hofmann. That's why I bring it up. This is John DeLynn. He's an ex-member of the church. He's paid by donations to produce a great deal of anti-Mormon material, podcasts. He's currently embroiled in an alleged sexual harassment scandal with a former employee. It'll be interesting to see where that goes. He has denied those allegations. They have claimed they have documents. He was described by a former member of the church, who's an ex-member of the church, when he talks about the strategies used, says, Mormon stories relies on the same abusive tactic. They're trying to coerce you into a situation where they can bombard you with so many doubt-provoking questions that they can cause your resolve to collapse, your identity to fall apart. Inside of that vacuum, created by an act of psychological rape, they hope to impregnate you with their own belief system. If that sounds abusive, it's because that's what it is. These groups have no moral compass when it comes to the lengths they will go to lead you out of the church. Again, that's a former member of the church who studies LDS culture. So why do I bring this up here? Well, I think you'll see some of the parallels in approach, but this is a screenshot of Delenn's Facebook page. Look what we have here. Mark Hofmann. It's a strange person to put on your Facebook page. Here's the full picture. If something seems to be true, it becomes accepted as true, it becomes true. I mean, that's a pretty cynical way to look at the world. It probably encapsulates Hofmann's attitude, but why on earth, if you were trying to appeal to Latter-day Saints, would you use that as your thing? I suspect he may reveal more about his attitudes by doing that than perhaps he wishes. Why would you intentionally feature the motto of an admitted and convicted forger, liar, and multiple murderer? But Hofmann attacked the church, so that makes him worth quoting, right? But it actually is a good summary of the strategy. You just have to make things appear to be true, and then they, quote unquote, become true. Hofmann said this, as far back as I can remember, I have liked to impress people through my deceptions. Fooling people gave me a sense of power and superiority. He later admitted he created material to embarrass the LDS Church, hoping it would pay large sums of money to keep them private. So that was Hofmann, but there are plenty of other people these days with evil intent who want power and superiority and money to attack the church and your faith. So be smart. Fourth lesson. And this is probably the thing that bothers people sometimes, is they say, well, why didn't President Hinckley know about this Hofmann guy? Why didn't Elder Oaks? Why didn't the prophets know? Why can they be deceived? Well, honestly, the Lord rarely reveals deception to leaders. If a leader could always or usually detect falsehoods, then people would keep from lying to them, not because lying was wrong, but because they're afraid of getting caught. This is really just a version of the question, why does God let bad things happen? Well, partly because if he punished every bad thing somebody did, you wouldn't do anything bad, not because you wanted to be good, but because you didn't want to be punished. So the Doctrine and Covenants makes it clear that the Lord cautions even Joseph Smith. He's told him that righteous people would support him and the wicked would seek to do him harm, but that Joseph should be cautious since, quote, you cannot always tell the wicked from the righteous. The Lord makes it clear he is not going to reveal people's hearts like that most of the time. When it comes to naivety in the face of malevolence or evil, Adlon Oaks reflected, there's blame enough to go around. We all need to be more cautious. In terms of our long-run interest in the church history, we now have the basis, and I hope we will have the will to clear away the Hofmann residue of lies and innuendo. Elder Anderson talked in General Conference about how he had friends that left the church as soon as the Time magazine article was published about this. And he said, and then a few months later, they were shown to be forgeries. I sure hope those people came back. I wouldn't want to be on Judgment Day saying, yeah, I left the church because of some forgeries. And then when they were shown to be forgeries, I just stayed out. But the Lord does protect his church, and other people can't derail that. What Hofmann seems to have been trying to do, and he later admitted this, was to actually produce the 116 pages. He was already taking notes. He had an outline prepared that they found. He had paid somebody to catalog every word used in the frequency in the Book of Mormon so he could try to imitate the word frequency. And he had created a few things of Martin Harris, remember, who was the one who wrote those pages and for whom there was very little handwriting except from that period, except Hofmann. So again, he had created the stuff to validate his own forgery. And imagine what else could have been wrong. Hofmann could have been killed by his own bomb. And if he had, nobody would have spent the months on the documents that Throckmorton did, and they would still probably be accepted as genuine. Had Hofmann died, the church probably would have always been blamed for his death, or at least that would have been a theory. Because again, nobody's going to put months of investigation into something like that once the guy's dead. He had put documents in his car, which were supposed to look like the McClellan collection. They were actually of a different name. I forget who, but it was a name that was very close to McClellan's name, but wasn't. So it makes you wonder if he was about to use those as some of the basis of his forgeries. In any case, if they'd been blown up in the trunk, then, you know, you could have said, oh, see, the church destroyed that terrible McClellan collection. Hofmann could have always not confessed him or admitted to him, always leaving some degree of doubt. You know, that would have been difficult, but because he admitted to it and went to jail for it, nobody can really question the story. A church leader or an employee could have done something really inexcusable like destroying documents, but none of them did, despite all the investigation. Critics could have purchased the documents and they could have restricted the access or could have only released partial things. You know, it would have been much harder for the church. Even worse, someone could have purchased them and then either accidentally or intentionally destroy them. And then you could never prove that they were forged because all you'd have would be photographs and it would be on the record and we'd have to deal with it as part of church history forever. There's an interesting coincidence. Throckmorton and his partner were working on figuring out the ingredients in the ink that Hofmann had made. And they had the recipe and they were trying to reproduce it because they needed to duplicate it so they could experiment on it and figure out if Hofmann had used it, if so, how he had faked it. They couldn't find anything on this stuff called gum arabic. They looked all over. And finally, Walker says, you know, my brother's got a PhD and he's at the FDA, you know, the Food and Drug Administration. Maybe he knows something about gum arabic. So he called him up and the brother says, are you kidding me? And he says, why? And he says, they just put me in charge of gum arabic and I'm standing right in front of a shelf that has everything ever published on it. Coincidence? Maybe, but I suspect not. And then there's the toy chemistry set. They were working and working. This was before they knew what the ink was made of. They couldn't figure it out. And one day Throckmorton is in a toy store and he looks down at a toy chemistry set and all the ingredients that are on Hofmann's list are in this toy chemistry set. So he had actually used, so they finally bought it and could get what he had used. And, you know, so this guy fooled the FBI with a toy chemistry set. Again, just a coincidence. And then we talked about the fingerprint on the check, you know, a nice little coincidence. Lastly, we're almost there. Church leaders walk by faith as we do. They're like us. They don't know everything. They're not usually granted insight into other people's evil intent. Their trust can be abused. They can be victimized. They can do the right thing and yet suffer a worldly difficulty. You know, think of all the false accusations they went through, all the sneers in the press, Hugh Pinnock losing all that money, you know. They're not immune to these things any more than you and I were. Elder Oakes said this, in order to perform their personal ministries, church leaders cannot be suspicious and questioning of each of the hundreds of people they meet each year. Ministers of the gospel function best in an atmosphere of trust and love. In that kind of atmosphere, they fail to detect a few deceivers, but that is the price they pay to increase their effectiveness in counseling, comforting, and blessing the hundreds of honest and sincere people they see. It is better for a church leader to be occasionally disappointed than to be constantly suspicious. But you get a window in this. After Elder Pinnock paid all this money to the bank to make good on the loan that Hofmann took out, he went down to President Hinckley's office. He felt sorry, Pinnock wrote, that we were going through these problems. He said, we just don't know what to do. Despite the hardship on Pinnock personally, the church could not use funds entrusted to it to pay Hofmann's debt. So here you have President Hinckley saying, you know, we're really sorry, this is really terrible. We don't really know what to do about it. All we can do is hang on and keep doing the right thing. And in conclusion, President Hinckley was a remarkable person, I think, and he was a genuine optimist. I think you see that all through here. And, you know, I often wonder if he ever had a down day. He just always seemed so jolly and happy. We talked about, you know, how much stress and pressure he was under. There's one statement that comes from just before some of these troubles started, and I've always wondered if he kind of took comfort in it and looked back on it during this period. He said this in April 1983 conference. He said, recently, while wrestling in my mind with a problem I thought to be of serious consequence, you know, and that's probably what he thought about this. This probably all looked pretty serious, and there didn't seem to be a good answer. He said, I went to my knees in prayer, and there came into my mind a feeling of peace and the words of the Lord, be still and know that I am God. I turned to the scripture and I read this reassuring statement spoken to the prophet Joseph Smith 150 years ago. Let your hearts be comforted concerning Zion, for all flesh is in mine hands. Be still and know that I am God. Sometimes there are things you have to do in a situation, but sometimes you just have to trust your Heavenly Father, be still, be quiet, be calm, and just know that He is in charge. He is in charge of the church, but He's also in charge of our lives. He has a plan that if we will cooperate with Him to the least degree, will get us somewhere wonderful. He doesn't just have a plan for all of us, for the group. He has a plan for you and for you and for you and for me, individually and personally. And you just have to trust that He will keep you on the right path if that's what you want. The leaders of the church were not perfect in this, I don't think, but neither were they malicious, neither were they evil, neither were they deceptive. They did the best they could, suffered because of it. There was nothing they could have done once it was enrolling to stop it. And yet they were vindicated. They came out looking fine, better than fine, I think. That's what will happen to us in our lives. We'll have enemies, we'll have people that attack us falsely. Some of those things won't be worked out in this life even. We'll have abuse that people never pay for. We'll have evil that never gets punished. But the good news of the gospel is that at the end of the day, those things will all be made right. That justice prevails, that anything we've been denied, we'll get back 100 times. That those who sin and do not repent will suffer far more than those that they caused to suffer. And that can be a sobering thought, but there are times when that can be a comforting thought, to know that God is a God of justice and mercy. He will give justice if we do not appeal to His mercy. If you want a Greek tragedy conclusion to this, Hofmann tried to commit suicide in his jail. They found him and pumped his stomach, but he had laid on the ground for 12 hours with his arm underneath him, his right arm, his forging arm, which withered away and is now useless. I don't know if that's divine punishment or if it's just an ironic sequence, but it's a pretty good symbol. At the end of the day, those who do evil and who fight the Lord's anointed will end up locked in a cell with a withered arm, not able to do much. I leave you that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.